In 1991, police entered an apartment in Milwaukee and found human remains in the freezer, in acid-filled barrels, in a filing cabinet. The man living there, Jeffrey Dahmer, had killed 17 people over 13 years. But before any of that, he was a kid, a quiet kid, the kind neighbors describe as shy, but never any trouble. His own father later wrote a memoir asking the question that still haunts criminal psychologists. How do you miss this? In this video, we're going back, past the headlines, to the childhood that shaped one of America's most notorious killers. Jeffrey Dahmer was born in 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and grew up mostly in Bath Township, Ohio. By most accounts, his early childhood looked unremarkable. A working father, a mother who struggled with anxiety and depression, and a marriage that grew increasingly tense. Lionel Dahmer, his father, later described a household full of arguments and a son who became quieter as the conflict grew louder. Around age 4, after surgery for a double hernia, those close to him noticed a shift. The outgoing toddler became withdrawn. As he got older, he started spending long hours alone in the woods near his house, collecting roadkill, examining animal carcasses, and eventually keeping bones in a shed behind the property. To his classmates, he was the weird but funny kid. To psychologists looking back decades later, these were the first visible threads of something forming underneath. In the 1960s, psychiatrist J.M. Macdonald proposed a theory that's still debated today, that 3 childhood behaviors, animal cruelty, fire setting, and persistent bedwetting past a certain age, appear together more often in people who go on to commit violent crimes. Dahmer's documented fascination with dead animals checks one of those 3 boxes clearly. The other 2 are far less documented in his case, and that's actually an important point. The Macdonald Triad isn't a checklist that predicts a killer. Most kids who are cruel to animals do not become violent adults. Most kids who wet the bed never hurt anyone. What the triad actually represents is something psychologists still find useful. These behaviors can be early signals of a child not processing distress, attachment problems, or difficulty regulating emotion. Signals worth paying attention to. Not as proof, as a flag. By his teenage years, Dahmer's behavior matched several criteria psychologists now associate with conduct disorder. A diagnosis given to children and adolescents who show a repeated pattern of violating others' rights or social norms. Cruelty to animals, social withdrawal, and increasingly, alcohol use, which Dahmer reportedly began in high school and used heavily to numb what he later described as constant, intrusive thoughts. Conduct disorder doesn't guarantee anything either. The vast majority of teenagers diagnosed with it grow into adults with no criminal record at all. But for a smaller percentage, particularly when conduct disorder goes untreated and combines with other risk factors, it can persist into adulthood as antisocial personality disorder. A pattern marked by disregard for others, lack of remorse, and difficulty forming genuine emotional attachment. Dahmer was never formally diagnosed as a child. No one was looking, and that absence of intervention is exactly where this story turns. In the late 1990s, researchers Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda ran what's now called the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, surveying over 17,000 adults about childhood trauma. Things like parental conflict, emotional neglect, and household instability. What they found was a direct, measurable relationship. The more adverse experiences a child had, the higher their risk, not just for mental health struggles, but for changes in brain development itself, particularly in areas that regulate stress and emotion. Dahmer's childhood, by his father's own published account, included high parental conflict, a mother who was often unwell and later left the family home, and a son who was, in his words, left alone for long stretches during a critical developmental window. None of this excuses what came later. But the ACE research gives us a framework for understanding it. Chronic early stress doesn't just affect behavior, it can physically shape the brain that produces that behavior. This is where neuroscience adds another layer. Brain imaging studies on individuals with psychopathic traits, Research led by scientists like Kent Keel and James Fallon consistently show reduced activity in the amygdala, the brain region central to processing fear and emotional responses, including empathy. The prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and moral reasoning, also shows reduced connectivity to the amygdala in many of these studies. The result isn't necessarily someone who can't think about right and wrong intellectually. Dahmer, by multiple accounts, understood exactly what he was doing was wrong. The result is someone whose emotional breaks, the gut-level discomfort most people feel at the thought of harming someone, may simply not engage the same way. Some of this appears to be present from birth. Some of it appears to be shaped by early environment. And separating the two, nature from nurture, turns out to be far harder than most people assume. For decades, this was framed as an either-or question. Was Dahmer born this way or made this way? Modern research suggests that's the wrong frame entirely. Twin studies, comparing identical twins raised apart, show that traits linked to psychopathy have a real genetic component, often estimated between 40 and 60% heritability. But heritability isn't destiny. The same studies show environment determines whether those genetic predispositions ever get expressed. Think of it less like a fixed switch and more like a dimmer. Genetics sets the range of what's possible, and environment, especially in the first decade of life, determines where the dial actually lands. A child with a genetic vulnerability toward reduced empathy, raised in a stable, attentive environment with early intervention, often never develops the full pattern. The same child, raised in chronic isolation and conflict with no intervention may. Dahmer, by every account we have, got the second version of that environment. So, could this have been stopped? With Dahmer, we actually have enough documentation to try to answer that honestly. Because the case wasn't hidden, it was studied. By researchers, by his own family, and eventually by Dahmer himself. Psychologists point to 3 specific windows where intervention was possible. The behavioral shift after age 4, noticed by everyone, investigated by no one. The animal remains his father found and called a strange hobby. The escalating drinking in high school that every adult around him chose to ignore. 3 signals. 3 missed chances. His father, Lionel Dahmer, later wrote about this in a book called A Father's Story. He describes noticing things, feeling unsettled, not knowing what to do with what he was seeing. Not from neglect, from not having the language to name it. And that's partly a problem of the era. Conduct disorder, the clinical diagnosis that captures many of the behaviors Dahmer showed, wasn't formally added to the DSM until 1980. In the 1960s, there was no standardized clinical framework for what his teachers were looking at. The pattern existed. The words for it didn't. That changed, in part because of cases like his. Modern threat assessment programs in schools were built by studying why patterns like Dahmer's went unrecognized for so long. Today, pediatricians screen ACE scores. School psychologists use structured behavioral checklists, tools that simply didn't exist in 1966. The research on early intervention is significant. Children with early conduct disorder symptoms who entered structured therapy before age 12 showed measurably lower rates of antisocial outcomes in adulthood. Not zero, but significantly lower. The developing brain still has plasticity. The window exists. It just doesn't stay open forever. So, could Dahmer's outcome have been different? Honestly, we don't know. Some researchers argue that by early adolescence, structural differences in prefrontal development were already present. Others argue the brain is shaped continuously, that meaningful change was still possible. The evidence doesn't give us a clean answer. But here's what every intervention study that's shown results has in common. It started with someone recognizing the pattern early enough to name it. A teacher, a school counselor, a parent who brought it to someone with the right tools. Not every pattern becomes a Jeffrey Dahmer, but every pattern needs to be seen. If this video made you think, subscribe. We break down cases like this every week. Jeffrey Dahmer's case isn't useful because it's shocking. It's useful because it's documented, in court records, in his father's own writing, in decades of follow-up research, closely enough that we can actually trace the line from childhood signal to adult outcome. That's the value of studying this, not the crimes, the pattern that came before them. If you want to see how this connects to a completely different kind of psychological manipulation, check out the video on screen now about how cult leaders use the exact same brain mechanisms to control entire groups of people. Subscribe so you don't miss the next case.